Hey, what's happening, APUSH kids? We're back for our next lecture here in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 3.8, the Constitutional Convention and debates over ratification. Our learning objective today that we have is learning objective 3I, which has explained the differing ideological positions of the structure and function of the federal government. And we have a few key ideas that kind of lead into this learning objective. Our first key idea today says delegates from the states participate in the Constitutional Convention and through negotiation, collaboration, and compromise proposed a constitution. So let's just kind of go back and set a little bit of the historical context of kind of what's going on here. So what we've talked about up to this point is the Articles of Confederation, which were our very first form of government. They were intentionally weak, and the whole purpose of that was to try and protect state and individual liberties. So liberties is just a fancy word for freedoms, right? Because once again, we're coming from a government from King George III that was tyrannical. It was dictatorship, essentially, a monarchy, and so we wanted to get as far away from that as possible. However, the problem with that is that the government, because it was intentionally weak, couldn't do a lot of really important things. Most importantly, it could not tax and it could not unify the states. And so this led to problems. The most significant of these problems is Shays' Rebellion, the rebellion of farmers in western Massachusetts over taxation issues and foreclosures of farms. And they couldn't stop this small rebellion of just about 2,000 farmers from being able to potentially overrun the government of Massachusetts. So what's going to happen in May of 1787, 55 delegates are going to go to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They're going to be in the very same building where they drafted the Declaration of Independence. And they had initially gone there to think about revising the Articles of Confederation. However, instead of revising those Articles of Confederation, they're going to replace it with an entire new constitution, the current constitution that we have today. Now, the biggest thing is that you need to understand is that at this convention, they're going to negotiate a series of compromises. And this is going to create the framework for the government that we have this day. Now, a lot of these compromises dealt with how representation would be chosen from the states to serve in Congress, so how that would all kind of work out. So there's a few kind of big early questions dealing with representation. Now, representation is kind of a key issue, and let me just speak on this for just a second. Representation means that you're going to have votes, people in the new Congress, in the new government, able to make decisions. States wanted to be able to maintain power. The only way you have power within a republic or a democracy is being able to have votes. So states wanted to make sure that they had enough votes in the new national government to maintain power, to be able to have a voice that was heard. And so there was several different compromises that had to happen to this end. So the first one that they had to deal with is large states versus small states. Now, when we talk about large and small states, we're not talking about in terms of physical land area. All right. For instance, if you look at the state of Georgia at the bottom part of the map, you see that Georgia has a really big land area. Virginia has a lot of land that's claimed. North Carolina has, a lot of land. We're not talking about that. Instead, what we're talking about is we're talking about the population of that state. So states that had really large populations versus states that had really small populations. So the states that had really large populations at this time were places like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, just to name a few, and those were kind of the really big states at that particular time. Really small states included places like Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Georgia, Vermont, New Hampshire. Those are the places that are going to be really small. And so this is going to be kind of the key kind of conflict here, right? So you had large states, and the large state plan was called the Virginia Plan. And so this plan said that the Congress or national government should have two houses or two parts, what's called bicameral, and that delegates, the people, representatives that were going to that national government, should be assigned according to population. What this simply meant was that states that had larger populations would have more representatives. And this was once again called the Virginia Plan. Now, on the other hand, smaller states, places like New Jersey, Delaware, etc., they supported a separate plan that was called the New Jersey Plan. Now, this called for a unicameral Congress. That means just one house or one part. And the states were equally represented just like the Articles of Confederation, with each state having only one vote. Now, in the country at the time, there was more small states than there were large states. So the small states could kind of band together against the big states. But under the Virginia plan, the large states would be able to outvote any of the small states. Now, eventually what they came up with is they came up with a compromise, and it's the most important compromise of the creation of the Constitution. This was called the Great Compromise. It's sometimes also referred to as the Connecticut Compromise because it was brokered by a man from the state of Connecticut. And what this did is resolve the differences between the large and small states by creating this bicameral Congress. And so here's what they were going to have. First, we were going to create what's called the Senate. And the Senate's also oftentimes referred to as the upper house. Now, every state gets 2 representatives, and they're going to serve a 6-year term. Now, it doesn't matter how big or small your state is, every state gets 2 representatives. So today, states like California, which has a huge population, gets 2 senators. States like Georgia, which has a much smaller population, gets 2 senators. In the House of Representatives, the number of representatives was determined by each state's population. So today, large states like California have many more representatives in the House of Representatives than smaller states like Delaware, which only have 1. The second major question at the Constitutional Convention was between the southern slave states and northern free states. Now, northern and southern states could not agree on whether or not to count slaves towards the population size. For instance, in the North, they argued that slaves shouldn't be counted, and slaves should be counted when thinking about taxes, where the South believed that the slaves should be counted towards congressional representation. Now, the problem that this set up is that if slaves were counted, southern states would have more votes and they would have more power in the House of Representatives, something that the South wanted, yet the North didn't. Now, to solve this issue, they came up with something that was called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And this allowed the states to count 3 of every 5 slaves towards their taxation and population size. This brings us then to key idea number 2. In it, it says the Constitutional Convention compromised over representation of slave states in Congress and the role of the federal government in regulating both slavery and the slave trade, allowing the prohibition of the international slave trade after 1808. Now, this was another major question at the early Constitutional Convention, whether or not to end slavery. Now, many Northerners wanted to use the convention to be able to end slavery, but anytime it was brought up at that convention, the Southerners threatened to leave the United States. Now, as a compromise for the South, the slave trade was continued for 20 more years, and a Fugitive Slave Act would be passed that would return runaway slaves to the slave masters. Now, the person at the center of this entire thing was James Madison. Now, he was the main negotiator, and he was also wrote most of the framework for the new government. He's oftentimes referred to as the father of the Constitution. This brings us then to key idea number 3. In the debate over ratifying the Constitution, anti-federalists opposing ratification battled with Federalists whose principles were articulated in the Federalist Papers. The Federalists ensured ratification of the Constitution by promising the addition of a Bill of Rights that enumerated, that means listed, individual rights and explicitly restricted the powers of the federal government. Now, after they had created the Constitution, which they worked on from May to September, where they created this framework for a new system, what they had to do after this was it had to be ratified. That means approved. And they set it at 9, right? 3/4 of the states. 9 out of the 13 colonies or states had to ratify or approve it to replace the Articles of Confederation. The problem was, though, is that many people were very much concerned about this idea of tyranny. What tyranny is when one person or one group has way too much power. Because this would give a lot more power to the national government and take away a lot more power from state governments. Many people feared that the stronger national government, and they wanted states to remain in power. Many of these people were called the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were led by people such as Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams. On the other hand, we had people that supported the new Constitution, and they supported the national government. They were called the Federalists. The Federalist leaders were people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And to help support this ratification process, they wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers to try and convince people to vote for the new Constitution and to counter the arguments of the Anti-Federalists. Now, in the ratification process, some states ratified the Constitution very quickly, and some states, with large majorities of Anti-Federalists, refused without a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. Now, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, which went into effect in 1789. But the Federalists wanted to make sure that all 13 states ratified the new government. Having a unanimous vote was very important to them. And so in 1789, they created the Bill of Rights. This was introduced, and the last 2 states ratified the Constitution in 1790. In 1791, the Bill of Rights would be approved. The role of the Bill of Rights was to protect individual liberties and protect us against the abuses of a too powerful government. That's our lecture for today. Next time, we'll begin to talk about some of the major ideas that are held within our Constitution. Until next time, go Pack.